Story 1. My dad had vascular dementia. My stepmother noticed the decline because she lived with him, and I noticed it because I saw him only 4 times a year for a couple of days at a time. My brother, who lived in the same city and saw him for an hour or two at a time, thought we were overreacting. Then my dad was asked to tell the time using his watch, and he said he could not. At first, people assumed the watch was just complicated. That was when my brother realized it was true. The biggest misconception about dementia is that it is only memory loss. It is not. It is a decline in cognitive processing. It can cause an inability to follow a conversation, with people often monologuing because it is easier and difficulty solving simple problems. Story 2. Speech patterns changed. The short, normal pauses between sentences became more ponderous and drawn out. I think this is because it is harder to find the right words and because the topic is slippery. Story 3. In my mother's case, she began telling me strange things about events at the Chinese restaurant adjacent to her third-floor apartment. Each week she said that, after the restaurant closed, the staff, dressed in white robes, would gather on the roof and conduct ceremonies. I took it at face value and told her that, in a free country, people can do as they wish unless they are harming someone. It was not until much later, after many other fantastical tales, that my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Once I understood what we were dealing with, it became clear that those stories were hallucinations caused by the disease. She was most likely experiencing sundowning. Story 4. This was years before any official diagnosis. My father is an avid tea drinker, and he would always remove the tea bag before adding milk. One time I was at his place and he offered me tea. He poured the milk in before removing the tea bag. It was not a big deal, but I was curious, so I asked why he did it that way. He looked puzzled and said he had always done it that way. There were several instances of him changing how he did things without realizing it was different from before. I saw other comments about not reading anymore. My father has a huge collection of books, but he has not touched them in more than 5 years. I have offered to help him sort through them and donate or sell some, but he does not want to part with any, so I will likely have to deal with it after he is gone. Story 5. I knew my dad was starting to get a little fuzzy, but nothing seemed out of place until our last trip to the gun range. My dad had been shooting his entire life. He was in the military and he taught me all about gun safety and range etiquette. Then I saw him turn away from the firing line with his gun still in his hand. He was going to get something out of the case, but he did not set his gun down. I saw it before the range officer did. I told my dad I was tired and that we should just go home. I took the gun, cleared it, and helped him pack everything up. I apologized to the officer, who had noticed what I was doing, and we left. I knew then that something was seriously wrong. It took a while longer before he was clearly symptomatic, but I knew that day that things would never be the same. Story 6. In our case, it was a very gradual decline in social engagement and conversational ability. One day my mother looked up and realized my father, who had once been the life of the party, could no longer carry on a conversation at dinner and had not been socially active for some time. She realized this decline had been occurring for over a decade. Then, suddenly, he could no longer recognize people and entered memory care within 3 years. Story 7. She asked the same questions and repeated the same conversation prompts every time we spoke. My mother did this not because she had forgotten our last conversation, but because those prompts became her script to mask memory loss and confusion. I was surprised at how early she developed a strategy to hide the signs. Story 8. Messy handwriting, where a person's writing becomes progressively worse, usually appears well before any significant memory loss. Can be frightening in retrospect. Story 9. My dad loved to travel his whole life and took us all over Europe when I was growing up. He was so excited about everything we were seeing, shouting, "Look kids, Big Ben, Parliament." About 10 years ago, we were on a trip to Scotland, driving through the most beautiful countryside, and I realized he wasn't looking. It has been a long, slow decline and incredibly sad. Story 10. I am a data scientist. A few years ago, I worked on a grant that studied Alzheimer's disease and mortality. Part of the study involved examining factors in medical records that preceded an Alzheimer's disease diagnosis and factors that predicted death after diagnosis. The most interesting finding was that the single best predictor of an imminent Alzheimer's disease diagnosis was the ICD-10 code Z91. 81 History of falling. Across all types of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, an increase in the number of documented falls was the most predictive factor. Even more striking was the pattern for mortality among patients already diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The top feature predicting near-term death was also Z91. 81, but with the opposite association. The data suggests that people in early stages of Alzheimer's disease lose coordination and fall frequently, whereas patients in terminal stages tend to be bedridden and stop falling. Story 11. Her reasoning skills are wacky. A few things my mother has said. When her checking account was overdrawn 3 times, she said, "I meant to do that." She handled the family finances, not my father. She said she could drive to my house, but I would not let her. It is 2.5 hours all highway driving, with part of it in heavy city traffic. She is 89, sleeps most of the day, and her car battery is dead. We are not replacing it. She took the pills from Monday's container today and did not take the Tuesday and Wednesday pills. Her response was, "I took other pills." She was a nurse. Story 12. My mother said a giant spider came out of her closet every night and went into the kitchen to eat the cat food. It was a pretty big clue that something was wrong. Story 13. My mother-in-law stopped watching narrative television and began watching only game shows. She used to love soap operas and a couple of old sitcoms, but she stopped watching them and watched only the Game Show Network streaming channel The Price is Right, the Barker era. She also stopped cooking because she was lazy and could not follow recipes or instructions. She stopped trusting anything, even calendars she had written appointments on. Dementia is mean as fuck. Story 14. It was my wedding day. I got married in Las Vegas because my family was in California, her family was in the north, and we lived in between. After the wedding and reception, he went to the room while my mom stayed with us. He entered the wrong tower and room and somehow convinced hotel staff it was his room, gaining access. The occupants were upset, and we eventually took him to the correct room. It seemed like a small mistake at the time, but he didn't drink, and I somehow knew it indicated cognitive decline. His mother had dementia. He cared for her until she passed away. Later he developed Alzheimer's disease and had to move to a care home, where he ultimately passed away. It is the small moments of forgetting or misremembering that we should notice. For example, saying a granddaughter was never at the lake on a trip when she had been. We dismissed it as ordinary forgetfulness, but in reality it was a sign. Do not miss the small signs. Story 15. People do not realize that Alzheimer's is a specific type of dementia. Not all dementia is Alzheimer's. I heard about this and then observed it in an aging coworker, an inability to detect sarcasm or certain types of humor. This was followed by occasional nonsensical responses to routine questions. Story 16. Thank you so much, everyone. I have been reading through all your comments. Someone very important to me is experiencing most of these symptoms, and she is only in her 40s. Your insights really help a lot. Story 17. Sleep disturbances, such as insomnia, can start decades before any other symptoms. Story 18. My grandfather shaved off his eyebrows and told us he had to. Story 19. My father's earliest sign of Lewy body dementia was experiencing false memories, such as being sad about a time he believed my mother had an affair with his gay friend. Story 20. Random rages that include accusations about things that never happened. I felt bad at first, but now I realize my mother was struggling. It is startling to see a full-blown tantrum over a hairbrush that I was accused of stealing, but it happens. The hairbrush was in her hand during the tantrum. In those moments, it is best to be encouraging and let her know things are okay. Say, "Oh, look, there it is. I'm so glad you found it." When I point out the success, she is able to relax. Also, take care of yourself. Seek therapy or treat yourself to a spa day. It is exhausting to support an adult who can go from silly and sweet to combative in the blink of an eye. There are many conflicting emotions. Be kind to yourself. Plan rest and time away, even if it is a short daily walk. Story 21. I'm currently experiencing this with my mother. and it seems to be going downhill rapidly. 2 weeks ago, she was found by police in her car an hour from home, with no idea who she was or where she was. Now she needs help with basic tasks and is having fewer lucid periods. Story 22. My father was diagnosed while still working as a mailman. He still did his route every day, talked to people, went to the bar, and read the paper. It was not until I was with him and his doctor that they asked whether he knew what day it was. They then asked what month and what year it was. He had no idea. The autopilot was so strong that he continued going through all the motions despite his short-term memory already being chipped away. Story 23. She started acting like a jerk. She went from soft-spoken to constantly nagging her husband and being angry. Then she began making strange accusations about things she believed he was doing, which he was not, and became very suspicious. Memory problems came later. Her main symptom for a long time was confabulation. Neighbors thought she was lying because her stories constantly changed, even about minor events, but it was very early dementia. Story 24. I did not know about this until my grandfather developed Alzheimer's disease. Hypersexual behavior. Perhaps it is uncomfortable to talk about. He had been a very prim, buttoned-up World War II veteran, yet he once exposed himself to his housekeeper and asked another person for sexual favors, which was completely out of character. He was diagnosed shortly after. When he moved to a ward for people with Alzheimer's, we observed similar behaviors in other patients, with elderly people making out in public areas and nurses constantly checking rooms to prevent sexual encounters. It was a real surprise. I had no idea. Story 25. My friend was a brilliant person who became isolated and insular, remaining connected only with family and an ever-dwindling number of friends. She lost interest in subjects she loved. She watched the same television shows repeatedly and spent excessive hours playing a video game while the television blared. She purchased items online and bought them again until she had multiples of the same things. Her family was in denial, blaming her drinking, but I insisted they take her to see a neurologist. After they did, she declined rapidly and died within a year. Story 26. Some time ago, my grandfather completely lost the ability to recognize the time of day. He would arrive at our house in the middle of the night thinking it was the afternoon. This change happened very suddenly, and his decline into Alzheimer's disease continued from there. Story 27. Hey, original poster. Not Alzheimer's but Parkinson's. My father was diagnosed 10 years ago. The first two signs that appeared long before his diagnosis were a marked decline in his sense of smell. He began wearing more aftershave, increasing anxiety about simple tasks and organization. He had a long and successful career as a senior educator and was responsible for many staff and students. Dealing with complexity and uncertainty was his specialty. We live in different towns and used to meet to watch football or soccer on Saturdays. Until about age 60, he enjoyed the bus and rail journey to the match. Gradually, he became painfully anxious about the journey, printing multiple timetables for buses and trains and even local taxi numbers. Eventually, he was too anxious to travel if a bus did not appear on time. This was completely out of character and, apparently, a marker of Parkinson's-induced anxiety. Not Alzheimer's, but it is worth noting personality changes in neurological conditions. Story 28. My mother became incredibly sweet and constantly praised me, which was out of character. She also swore she had never hated my husband when I was dating him and effusively praised how wonderful he was. I noticed these signs only in retrospect. Story 29. My mom used to have outbursts of anger when she could not remember. She is in remission now. She was on a medication that removed the amyloid plaques as part of a clinical trial. I did not realize how bad she had become before she started improving. She is like she was about 5 years ago, sharp, sassy, and raring to go. There is hope after losing my aunt, grandmother, and 2 great aunts to it. Story 30. I'm in my mid-50s and it feels like word recall is becoming an issue when it wasn't a problem before. It's not like I can't say cat when looking at a cat. It's more that when I'm trying to name a specific thing, I can't get the exact word from my brain to my mouth. I'm very worried about this. Story 31. In my parents' case, I started noticing increasingly poor reasoning and strange logic behind his actions. I could tell his driving had become unsafe, and I had to convince my family not to let him drive anymore. He can also be very defensive if you try to get him to change or admit that anything is wrong. Sometimes he has personality changes, becoming more aggressive or agitated, or very withdrawn. Story 32. One of the first signs for my gran was repeatedly feeding her dog in the evenings, forgetting whether she had already fed him. The dog gained weight quickly and had to be rehomed once the family realized what was happening. She also began leaving the heating on constantly, and we found money in the bins. I miss you, Gran. Story 33. I work in a busy accident and emergency department. Another often missed sign is self-neglect and hoarding. These people often slip through the cracks because they appear to manage and decline outside support. Story 34. My mum died of Alzheimer's disease a few months ago, and I am terrified every day when I forget the smallest thing. Story 35. Among other signs, she had difficulty telling time and keeping an agenda. My mother often arrived for visits much too early. She was at the door at 6:30 in the morning instead of 9:30 and sometimes came for appointments that were still days away. Story 36. I think many of these stories highlight something important. It is not just the change in behavior but the person's perception of it. Of course, as we age we may become forgetful or do things differently, but someone with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias is less likely to realize that anything is amiss. My go-to example is my aunt and her brother. He had run-of-the-mill forgetfulness after over 80 years of life. He voluntarily stopped driving, moved into a smaller condominium, and would say, "I just do not recall things as well as I used to." He knew his memory was different. My aunt constantly worried that he had Alzheimer's disease, but he just had normal age-related short-term memory loss. Meanwhile, she began forgetting things, withdrawing socially, or behaving oddly and then creating a narrative to explain it. When we suggested a neurological evaluation, she became instantly defensive. She refused to give up her house or car until things became dangerously bad, and even then it was a struggle. Story 37. My mother told stories about fun times with Paris Hilton, but looking back maybe it was her friend Maxine. At least my mother enjoyed telling them. Story 38. Sudden outbursts of anger can be frightening. It happened with my grandfather, who was the nicest person you would ever meet. One day, we were in the middle of a conversation and he slammed his fist on the side table, telling me to stop talking before he got up and left the room. I sat there in total shock, not knowing what had just happened because in all 18 years of my life up to that point he had never once yelled at me. Our conversation was not tense or heated. We were chatting about an upcoming vacation. 6 months later, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Story 39. I am a neurologist. Early signs vary from person to person, but in my experience they are usually fairly similar in Alzheimer's disease. Short-term memory deficits, such as repeating oneself, forgetting recent conversations, losing items around the home, and so on, appear fairly early and are often dismissed until they become bothersome to family or a spouse. Apraxia or dyspraxia. A loss of the ability to perform previously easy tasks, usually begins with complex activities such as driving, using a mobile phone or computer, cooking, or other multi-step tasks. Eventually it progresses to simpler tasks such as dressing, bathing, toileting, walking, and eating. Executive function deficits tend to come later. People have trouble focusing or staying on task. Paying bills and managing finances become problematic. Anything that requires quick processing becomes harder. Aphasia, meaning expressive or receptive language deficits, causes trouble finding the right word, difficulty forming sentences, and use of simple or repetitive language. Visuospatial awareness difficulties, or problems recognizing spatial relationships between objects, greatly impact driving and overall independence. Neuropsychiatric symptoms include irritability, agitation, insomnia, anxiety, and depression. The most common is apathy, a loss of interest in social and pleasurable activities. Many other symptoms can occur, but these tend to appear early. Most patients lack insight into their impairment, so families usually bring them for evaluation. Patients may feel fine early on and attribute difficulties to aging. I am less concerned when patients complain of memory loss and more concerned when patients think they are fine but their families are worried. Story 40. My dad was always interested in the weather and computers. On my wedding day, rain was forecast. Even during the sunny ceremony, he kept checking the weather app, worried rain would ruin my special day. When he got a new printer, he needed my help installing it. Afterwards, he kept unplugging cables, claiming it was broken. He passed away at 71 in August. I love you, Papa. Story 41. Some people may become sexually disinhibited. If your grandfather suddenly behaves in a sexually inappropriate way and you have never seen this before, it may be because the brain region that inhibits inappropriate speech is deteriorating. Story 42. Alzheimer's is a cruel disease. My dad became more argumentative than usual. He began swearing, using the F word, which was completely out of character for him. I had never heard him swear in my life. Maybe 2 years later, he was diagnosed. He was always worried about whether he belonged where he was and whether he would get in trouble, and he often wanted to go home even when he was already home. I would say, okay, let's go. We would drive around the block and pull back into the driveway. I would point out his address on the house and the front yard decorations, and he would happily go inside, glad to be home. Then we would look at his favorite clocks that I helped him build. He would remember some details from back then, and I think that helped break the mood and put him in a place he remembered. One thing he did all the time was go through his shirt pockets and shuffle papers around. So I took blank business cards and wrote things on them such as, "Your name is Tony. Your wife is Amy. You have a daughter, Rosalie, and a son, Michael. You live in Florida and you used to live in New York. You are supposed to be here. You're not alone. Your wife is in the other room." Simple reminders helped curb the repetitive anxieties he always had. He liked to tear up books and magazines, which seems common with this illness, so unwanted ones were given to him to do what he wanted. When he got cranky, I would appeal to his inner dad and ask for his help with something. Key lime pie was something I often needed his help with. Easy, minimal ingredients, and the old-fashioned hand mixer with the crank he loved to use. It was the sound, I think. Distraction was a good remedy, and later there would be a little flashback to him helping make the pie when we'd eat it. My mom liked to quiz him, asking who his son was and where he lived. I couldn't do that. It felt like I was putting him on the spot. Story 43. He began getting lost while driving in the city where he had lived his whole life. He asked me to take over paying his bills because he could not write checks properly anymore. He started eating only lunch meat, cheese, and chips because he had trouble cooking, even though he had been a chef. He said he had decided to stop drinking coffee for a year, though he loved coffee, but it turned out he could not remember how to turn the coffee pot on. This all happened just before we moved in to care for him. He was so happy to have coffee made for him again. Story 44. No two people will react the same or have identical symptoms. My mother could recite her social security number and write very well in cursive, but could not remember what she had for lunch a few hours earlier. Story 45. They lose depth perception and peripheral vision, experience hearing loss, and undergo personality changes. For example, shifting from always being nice to becoming mean and judgmental. Story 46. My grandmother watched us when my parents went on their 10th anniversary trip to Hawaii. I remember her folding the dirty clothes. Story 47. It started with my wife. Every time we went out, she would say she had seen that person before. At first I thought it was nothing, but then she began saying she knew that person. Then it dawned on me that she was slipping. Story 48. There were construction works on the other side of the street that we could see from our window. My grandmother kept telling me that the workers were constructing and deconstructing the house repeatedly. She would pack her things several times a week and sneak out of the house while we were busy or asleep. We would go look for her, and when we found her, she would be very upset, thinking we were keeping her against her will. She claimed she was 20 years old when she was actually 85, that she had just moved to the capital, and that she had lessons to give at school the next day. She used to be a teacher. The list goes on. We were uneducated about the disease and how to act around someone suffering from it. She lived another 5 years like that, gradually worsening. We could not accept it and never tried to live in her world. We always tried to bring her back to reality, which, in hindsight, was a waste of time and energy. We probably should have let her live happily in her own world. Story 49. I realized something was wrong with my ex's grandmother when she showed me a giant stockpile of used incontinence pads that she treated as if they were precious. I watched her more closely and discovered that the delicious tuna snack she had been raving about was actually cat food. Story 50. My mom has always been pretty scatterbrained. It became markedly worse before she began showing real memory problems. She began nursing her resentments more. It was a subtle shift, but in hindsight it was a warning sign. She had always been the type to have a glass of wine with dinner. She began drinking almost a bottle a day because she would forget she had already had one and another glass sounded good. Story 51. Taking someone out of a familiar environment can completely disorient them. Grandma might seem mentally sharp at home, following the same routine she has managed independently for 25 years. But if you take her on vacation, move houses, or have to stay in the emergency department overnight, suddenly things are not as they seem. Story 52. This kind of scared me because I have 3 poems I have recited almost daily for most of my adult life. I am 68. Each poem takes 3 to 5 minutes to recite. Recently, I have had trouble remembering some words and must go back and repeat lines, sometimes several times until I get them right. Also, for about the last year, I have not been saying them as often. I use them as a sleep aid. Repetition helps me fall asleep. Story 53. One thing that really caught me off guard was how early taste preferences can change. My grandmother suddenly developed an intense sweet tooth in her late 60s, even eating frosting straight from the can, although she had barely tolerated desserts her whole life. It turned out to be one of the first neurological changes before any noticeable memory problems. The doctors explained it as her brain craving quick energy as cognitive processing became more difficult. Story 54. An elected official in my area has shown signs of cognitive decline. He could not finish his sentences and often seemed confused. He ultimately dropped out, but his replacement lost and the other party won. The replacement candidate exhibits repetitive speech patterns and frequently fabricates claims about topics such as magnets. The cognitive decline is obvious, but about 49.8% of constituents insist he is the sharpest person ever, regardless of age. This is very confusing. Story 55. I was a child when my grandmother first started showing symptoms. If I remember correctly, she was missing for about 2 to 3 days and no one knew where she was. Fortunately, a neighbor found her sleeping on a bench in the park across the street from her apartment building. It was the park she used to take me to often. She kept saying, "I do not live here. This is not my apartment." And she had already lost a lot of her memories. She had lived in an apartment directly across the street with my mother when my mother was a child. She lost about 30 to 40 years of memory. She completely forgot who I was. She somewhat remembered my brother, who is 16 years older than I am. She mentioned her sisters often, but they had been gone for a while. As I got older, her memories regressed further. She remembered being a child, her sentences became broken, and she grew more aggressive. She became nonverbal at one point, and then she died from a Clostridioides difficile infection. I really wish I had had more time with her. I am trying not to cry. Story 56. My cousin and I look similar, although she is about 20 years older than I am and totally different in non-physical traits. My grandmother would often call me her name by accident. No big deal, as I am sure we have all confused the names of close family members. I usually just ignored her slip of the tongue. Then my grandmother started talking to me as if I were my cousin. She said something like, "Your father went fishing yesterday. I suppose you could not go because you had to work at the ice cream shop." It is my uncle who fishes and my cousin who works at the ice cream shop. My father has not fished in 40 years and I have never worked in a shop. I realized her calling my cousin's name was not just a slip of the tongue anymore. She really thought she was talking to my cousin. Story 57. My mother was a highly intelligent woman, and she was able to hide much of her condition for years. I still think I caught it early on, though, but that is through the eyes of her child who knew her very well for 40 years. One of the early signs was her inability to remember her room number at a hotel. All the doors are the same aside from the number. She simply could not remember it, multiple times in the same day. Aside from that, I would have chalked up other things to old-timers' forgetfulness. Walking into a room and forgetting why you went there happens to healthy people too. She would occasionally retell a story, but it progressed to telling the same story twice within 10 minutes. Because she was a very smart woman, she successfully hid many of these signs from family, friends, and acquaintances. Then she suddenly declined. One day she was hiding it, and the next day she had forgotten her grandchildren's names and was asking me where I was when John F. Kennedy was shot. I was born 2 decades after that. She had lost her sense of time and the order in which events occurred. It was not much longer after that, maybe a month or two, when she did not recognize my voice or my face. It is terrible to grieve for someone while they are alive and then to mourn them a second time when they pass away. Story 58. The worst is when you speak with them and they realize they do not remember things they should, and then they become sad. Story 59. I cannot open external links. Please paste the text you want processed. I will then correct spelling, expand all acronyms to their full forms, remove meaningless repetition, fix punctuation, remove special characters and links, and return only the clean text suitable for Azure text-to-speech. Story 60. A change of personality, sometimes for the better. My mother had hated dogs her entire life and refused to pet or acknowledge them. When I got a dog, she would not pay attention to her. Now she brings treats and toys and enjoys petting my dog. Story 61. Having lived through this a couple of times, a very early sign was that both of my parents, at different times, lost the ability to focus. Put them in a noisy room and they could not follow a conversation. They could not filter out the background noise. The same occurred with visual distractions. This appeared long before memory issues started and has continued to get noticeably worse. Story 62. I have early-onset Alzheimer's disease. I retired a while back because I found I could not do the bookkeeping at my job without becoming confused in the middle of a task. I would have to walk away and regroup to get my thoughts in order. My father died from Alzheimer's disease, so I felt it was a matter of time. To date, I am seeing a neurologist and taking one of the medications for Alzheimer's disease. The comment about cognitive skills was spot on. I am sharpest in the morning and can become confused in the evening. Feels like, and probably is, mental fatigue. My memory is turning into a sieve. I now have lists for everything. Even so, my phone increasingly confounds me and it takes longer to find things on it. My balance began to decline early on along with my number sense. My vocabulary is still quite good, and autocorrect and predictive typing help me with most common words. Story 63. When someone announces that nobody knows what a magnet is. Story 64. Excessive feeding caused the dog's weight gain. After we could not find another explanation, we discovered she was feeding him multiple times a day. Story 65. Lying, especially when it is out of character. Repeating questions 5 minutes after you answered them. Hitting on members of the opposite sex when it is very inappropriate, that is, my father-in-law flirting with my female friend. Buying or craving large amounts of candy. Not being able to handle basic chores, such as making sure the pets have water. Story 66. My cousin's father-in-law was a well-respected doctor who took pride in his work and family. One day he began to have a surprisingly hostile attitude toward his wife, something he had never done in more than 40 years of marriage. He would also stop talking at dinner. They were nearly divorced before a colleague noticed his strange behavior and he saw a neurologist who diagnosed aphasia. Over time, he gradually stopped speaking. When he did speak, he could only use statements he had often used at work. For example, a greeting would be, "The patient is in room 1. Story 67. My nan started offering to buy everything. If I so much as looked at something on a shelf for 3 seconds, she would offer to buy it for me. When we visited, my kids would leave with money stuffed in their pockets, and she would ask everyone, 'Do you need any?' Until she had nothing left to give away. I know now it is a fairly common sign, but at the time I was so confused. Story 68. retelling stories that happened 20 years ago but presenting them as if they occurred just days ago. Story 69. My dad was recently diagnosed, but we had been pressuring him to get tested for 2 years. He kept leaving his phone in the bathroom and did not even realize it was missing. He developed a very flat affect and stopped saying good morning or hello. He began using the wrong vowel sounds in celebrity names. Most older parents mispronounce new celebrity names, but saying Tom Hanks instead of Tom Hanks was worrisome. Story 70. My neighboring country's president was showing signs of dementia so severe about 10 years ago that his best friend, Jeff Epstein, pointed it out in one of the emails made public this week. Story 71. My mum is going through this now. She got a diagnosis from the doctor last week, but I have seen it progress rapidly over the last 6 months. She had a problem during coronavirus disease 2019 with early diabetes and was given medication, but it made her very nauseous. The doctors kept telling her it would take a few more weeks for it to subside, but it never did. She was admitted to hospital with severe dehydration. After a few weeks, she was discharged, but her short-term memory was affected. She was checked then, and there was no dementia, so she was already not doing well. My first sign was that she was not able to take her medication on time. I had set up pill boxes and alarms, but she stopped following them, so we had to get help for that. Next, she began to have trouble finding the words for objects. She would say thingy and describe things vaguely, which made it exhausting and frustrating for both of us. Then she started mixing up stories or blending events into something different that did not make sense. She would call me crying, thinking she had called someone else. She insisted she knew a man who was younger than me, had the same name as me, and that she went with him in his car, even though I had been with her just hours earlier and we had gone shopping together. She described strange men coming to her door, asking about things and stealing keys from the keychain. They never came into the house, and they did not know which key was which. She has started to fill her handbag with items she thinks are important and likely to be lost, but some are random, like a bag of flower seeds. She has also removed many pictures from photo albums and scattered them, often damaging them. We have recently been attending speech therapy and have identified some specific issues. If given 2 or more instructions to remember, she cannot manage them. Simple single commands are okay, but sequences are not. I also think her visual processing is becoming very difficult. We have gone to the optician several times. Their tests are fine, but the next day she says her glasses are useless. Every day there seems to be a new issue that requires more appointments and visits. Watching the person who raised you, the only person in the world who loves you and wants the best for you, change in front of you is truly awful. I just want her to be as happy and healthy as possible, but I am in a losing battle with a condition that seems intent on destroying someone. It is making me resent her. I know she is not trying to be like this, but everything I do is not enough to make her okay. I dread how it will get worse because I know it will. I would do anything to make her happy and healthy, but nothing seems to help. Story 72. What consistently surprises me is that people experiencing this decline do not panic about it. My father began forgetting my name or where certain towns were, and he just shrugged it off. He did not seem to think it was anything to worry about, even when it became dangerous. Until you really experience it, it is shocking how well they can cover it up. You can have a person who hears noises, does not know where they are most of the time, and cannot manage most aspects of their life, yet when you take them to a doctor or psychologist, they act completely normal, as if they have all their faculties. It is both shocking and incredibly frustrating. Story 73. The most surprising thing I found was the repetition of little sing-song phrases. For my grandmother, it was a short song she would sing in response to good night. She had heard it as a child, and whenever someone said, "Fair enough," she would reply, "There was a fairy, his name was Nuff, fair enough." It was one of the more endearing aspects of her dementia. Story 74. My dad was the best person I have ever known. He developed early-onset Alzheimer's, but no one believed me, not my mom or my siblings. I knew something was wrong when we went to Paris together. He was tipping servers and coffee shop staff and even the artist who sketched my daughter. Then he said someone had pickpocketed him or that my mom had stolen his money. My dad was an avid traveler. He always told me to tip a few euros in Paris for great service. He also told my son some inappropriate stories about his childhood that he would never normally have shared. It was funny, though. I really miss my dad. Story 75. While I was at school, my mom took all the clothes in my drawers and closet to the laundromat and washed them. She dried and folded them and left them there. When I came home, I was confused, and when I asked her, she said she didn't know. A couple of days later, I got a call from the laundromat attendant who knew my mom. She asked if my mother was okay because she had left all the clothes there. After a couple of other incidents, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. She was only 45. Story 76. My mom started struggling with basic directions, even in the town she had lived in for 20 years. The progression was so slow that by the time she received her diagnosis, it had become a family joke. If my mom suggested we go one way, we took the other because she was always wrong. Only much more recently, after she went into full-time care, did we realize she had not always been so bad with directions. There had been a slow, almost unnoticed decline over about 10 years, and the jokes were her way of explaining it. Story 77. My mother was 55 when we started noticing signs. I know that is young, but it was almost 8 years later that she was diagnosed with posterior cortical atrophy and early-onset Alzheimer's disease. She stopped doing her hobbies, but more alarming was her inability to supervise children as a teacher's aide. She was fired and could not work after that. We had to make her stop driving. Story 78. Loss of the sense of smell can occur years before any obvious symptoms and may be subtle. Story 79. When my grandmother died of cancer, my grandfather had a delusion that she had cheated on him with a man she had dated when she was 16. He believed the man had slipped out of the bedroom window one day while he was home and my grandmother was still alive. The man in question also had cancer and could barely breathe, let alone sneak out of a window. My grandmother probably had not seen him for 50 years or more. Yet my grandfather was so convinced she was cheating while dying of multiple myeloma. At first we thought it was a strange grief coping mechanism, but then he began to decline with Alzheimer's disease over the years, so it was probably an early sign of that. Story 80. My grandmother was the absolute sweetest person. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she began having severe outbursts of anger. For over 30 years, I had never heard her say a single curse word, and now she was prone to cursing over the most trivial things. Her doctor later said it was likely rooted in frustration and fear caused by growing confusion in her thoughts and her perception of events around her. It was heartbreaking to watch my grandmother fade away. The last time I saw the woman who raised me, she did not recognize me. Story 81. For me, it was the change in personality. My dad was always the most jolly, happy-go-lucky, positive person. He was the dad my friends still have fond memories of because he was welcoming, understanding, and like a big kid, the fun dad. Then, apart from lapses in memory, he began to get easily agitated. His interest in anything declined, and now that he is in the later stages, his original personality has all but disappeared except for small glimpses. Story 82. My great-grandmother lived across the street from me when I was a kid. I remember listening to my great-aunt and her husband complain about how my great-grandmother would follow them around the house and close every window they opened, saying people were going to break in. At first it was brushed off as worry about crime in our relatively quiet neighborhood. But over time she stopped painting, her favorite hobby. She had been a great artist. She also stopped recognizing the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Even I, who lived across the street and saw her every day, had to remind her who I was. After that, my great-aunt moved out of state and took her along. My great-grandmother died a few years later. Story 83. My mother suddenly could not figure out how to fasten her seatbelt. Story 84. My grandfather was aware of what was happening sometimes. Once he followed my family to our van after a visit, then pretended to get in. He said, "Wait a minute, who are you guys?" With a smirk, then asked which way the house was and started walking down the sidewalk. We all had to get out and tell him, "No, Grandpa. This way, no, this way." He kept smiling, turning the wrong way, and laughing at us until he hugged us all and said goodbye. He got really rough toward the end, but he was always making jokes. Story 85. My dad started making things up that sounded plausible when he could not remember. One time I came to visit and my mom was not home when I arrived, so I asked him where she was. He told me she was at a meeting. That was reasonable. She served on a couple of boards and committees in town at the time. When she got home, I asked her how the meeting had gone. She said no. She had been driving my nieces home. My dad did not even know he was doing it. It was as if his mind grabbed the nearest reasonable explanation when he did not actually know, and that was the answer he gave. Story 86. My dad had Alzheimer's. One early sign was not understanding where to put food. We found frozen food in the refrigerator and cans in the freezer. I wrote this off as an old man who never did house chores. He started sleeping much more and eating much less, but otherwise seemed okay. Later he moved in with me, and I gave him the job of watering my plants. He watered the cat condo covered in obviously fake greenery and could not fathom that it was not a real plant. He also could not understand board games anymore or realize that Red Dead Redemption was a video game, not a movie. Then he went downhill quickly, talking about needing to call his parents. Eventually he became completely incontinent and had to be moved into memory care. We were lucky that he always knew me and my mom, and he remained sweet and funny until he died. I know you did not ask about vascular dementia, but it feels very different. My mom has it. The first two signs were that she had been a beautiful quilter and suddenly did not understand pattern directions. She cut pieces incorrectly and could not figure out how to piece the shapes together. When I tried to help, she could only follow one simple instruction at a time, and even that was a challenge. She was upset that her new patterns were written terribly when they were not. The second sign was sudden racist and xenophobic comments. She had been strongly anti-racist when I was young. When she began speaking about people in a hateful way, I knew something was broken in her brain, but I did not realize it was early dementia. Story 87. We always thought Grammy could not hear us. She had her ears cleaned and a hearing test. Her ears were fine. The problem was in the processing between when she heard something and when she could acknowledge it. I have always felt bad for shouting, thinking she could not hear us. God, I miss her. Story 88. My dad, who had called me maybe twice in 25 years, began calling me multiple times a day. Story 89. Forgetting major events and not telling their spouse when they hear the news. This isn't a relative but a family friend. A few years ago, my dad died of cancer. I was his executor, so I handled his affairs and had his cell phone because I did not want his friends calling me months later or worse, after services ended and finding only silence. I called his contacts to let them know. Most people reacted as expected. They knew he had not been well, so the calls were brief. One friend was different. We are both native English speakers with no language barrier. When I called to tell him my dad had died, he kept thinking it was my dad calling and I had to repeat myself several times. I thought he might be hard of hearing. He asked how he died. I said cancer. He offered his condolences and we ended the call. A month later my dad's cell phone rang. It was the same friend. He spoke to the phone as if he were talking to my dad. I told him again that my dad had died a month earlier and we went through the whole conversation about how and when. 2 months later he called again. I was incredulous and curt because I had already told him twice. I eventually let the phone's battery run out and did not answer for a while before I ported the number to my voice over internet protocol provider. That Christmas his wife sent a card to my dad expressing concern that she had not heard from him. I had been forwarding my dad's mail to my aunt, who lives in the same city. She called me and asked whether I had notified everyone. By then I was certain the friend was in the early stages of cognitive decline because I had told him 3 times that my dad was dead. My aunt called his wife to let her know, because the husband clearly was not communicating this to her. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.